be turning to Matthew chapter, and we're going to continue. We've been loosely circling the matter of prayer, and we're going to continue with a passage that is about far more than prayer, but it's one great conditioner about prayer. In Matthew 6, in fact, it's about 3 spiritual exercises or religious exercises. Most religions practice these exercises. Jesus deals with them thoroughly differently from religion. This is Matthew 6, and we'll do verses 1 through 18, but we'll leave out the Lord's Prayer. Leave out that section that we call the Lord's Prayer, verses 9 through 15. So we'll go 1 through 8 and 16 through 18. Rather lengthy passage, but when you leave out that mid-passage on the model prayer, it shortens it a little bit, but that's really not what we want to talk about anyway. And I want us to read when we get to page 5 on the manuscript. I'll tell you when we get there, and then we can pass these out. But I want you to write something down at the beginning. At the very beginning, write down a statement that is a kind of a synopsis statement or a summary statement of the entire passage. And I hope this haunts us as we go along. Here's the quote: "The most important part most important part of a Christian's life is the part that nobody sees but God." Most important part of a Christian's life is the part that nobody sees but God. And I would guess if we knew what this was about in advance, none of us would want to pray out loud just now. Because this is a real sifting passage, got a real strong word at the beginning.
Is that your quote?
I don't know. I don't know where that was in my notes at this passage from a long time ago. I don't know whether it is or not. I've used it in preaching on this passage, but I've never taught it like this, because it really laid hold of me recently in light of something I read in the newspaper. I'll share it with you when we get there. Let's pray just a moment. Lord, would you grant your Spirit sifting work in us right now? Let us be honest at the core. Let us be real before you at the core, at the center of our character. And forgive us for the endless parade. And thank you for time alone with you, where just you and each of us can resolve so many things that we can't do when we're in a crowd. And Lord, I remember a long time ago how you spoke to me through a professor when you said, "Pity the man who has his greatest spiritual experiences in a crowd." Grant us the walk with you that is alone enough that our real character can be developed by you. And help us when we're in public, that our public lives would be an extension of that private walk with you and not a parade. And grant this evening that we would be genuine and real, but we'd not be self-conscious even about trying to be genuine and real, just to face you and walk with you. And bless every one of these men. Just fit the blessing that suits the need, and move on our hearts this evening. Bless those that are not here, and undertake for them, and then use this time for your ultimate and eternal purpose. And I trust you for this and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, let's read just a little bit. I don't know exactly how to do this. I don't know whether to interpret and then read as we interpret, which might be the best way to do it. But in order to get the feel of it, let's read. Verse 1 contains, actually, the strong word is the first word in verse 1. It it actually is an alert word. It's stronger than it sounds in the King James Bible. My King James Bible says, take heed. It actually says, beware. It's a strong alert word, or be cautious is the word. So here is a case where this calls for extreme alert. And note this, that's a present tense continuous verb. So your red flag should never be down at this point. In other words, this covers all time. There's not a moment, which means there won't be a moment in your conscious life, in all likelihood, when you're not tempted by the temptation and may sin with the sin that's here in this passage. This is a sifting, and yet it's a happy sifting, because you can see exactly what he's talking about. It's not hard to agree with, because you see it in yourself and you see it around you all the time. So he says, take heed that you do not your alms. So here's the first religious exercise, almsgiving. And we'll come back and talk more about this. Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. And that's where the wrong motive comes in. We'll come back to that also, because there's a gigantic idea here. In fact, I get the title for tonight's study from that expression, to be seen of them. It's a rather shocking word in our culture, to be seen of them. Otherwise, that is, if you do this, you have no reward of your Father who is in heaven. That's a negative side. God pays no attention as far as gratification is concerned. Therefore, when you do your alms, do not sound a trumpet before you. Now, there's a great deal of uncertainty about what that expression means, whether that's figurative or it goes back to a time when they actually did blow trumpets at the time the offerings were received. And the hypocrite would gather there knowing it was nearly time to be there to be seen, giving his money when the trumpet sounded. Do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Here's the contrast. But when you do alms, let not your left hand know what your right hand does, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. Now, does anyone, what other translations of the Bible do we have here? Do we have NIV? Who has an NIV?
I do.
Wait. Okay, anybody else? An NASV? What do you have? You have an NASV. Okay, let's get all three readings. Wade, would you read verse 3 in the NIV?
But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
All right, one more, verse 4.
So that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you.
All right, now does everybody see the difference?
Openly.
Okay, the word openly. The word openly is not in the oldest manuscripts of the Bible. And therefore, your recent translations almost all omit it, and properly. That's not the point here. The point here, in fact, the word openly obtrudes the very problem we're talking about. Your Father who sees in secret himself will reward you, period. He will choose the way of the reward, and it'll be better than anything you could have ever chosen. Okay, read it out of the NASB.
3 and 4.
No, just 4.
That your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you.
Okay, so the word openly is omitted. Now read the Amplified. And this one, and listen to this one carefully, watching your text while he reads. Read verses 3 and 4.
But when you give to charity, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your deeds of charity may be in secret, and your Father, who sees in secret, will reward you. And here's again is the word openly.
Okay, so see, Amplified tries to get in all translations and all interpretations, so they put that in, knowing full well it's not in the old manuscripts, but that's exactly what that translation means. And you ought to own an Amplified. That's not a representative reading right there. It's far more valuable. In fact, you get about 20 translations in one, and so all your shades of meaning are opened up, and that's what it does. It amplifies the various translations of the text. Okay, look at verse 5. Here's your second spiritual practice. The first one's almsgiving. Now comes prayer. And when you pray, you shall not be, so here's the negative side again, you shall not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say, and by the way, that's the same expression that's used up in verse 1, to be seen of them. And it's a devastating expression. We'll come back to it in a few minutes. That they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, enter into your closet, and when you've shut the door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret shall reward you openly. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think, who comes to mind here? What passage in the Old Testament comes to mind here? It's Elijah on Mount Carmel. Those heathen people talked for hours, prayed for hours, repeating the same thing over and over again. Elijah's prayer was very brief comparatively, and fire came.
I thought you were going to say Catholics.
No, I'm talking biblically. But Baptists are as bad as Catholics. Ours are just subtle. You listen to us pray on any Sunday morning. It has staggered me time and again. You would think the person who prays wasn't even in the service. It's almost like it's a rote thing where we've already got it all. In other words, my mother used to say, when somebody speaks to you, don't change the subject. And the more important the person speaking, the more important it is to not change the subject. The question is, did God say anything in that service? Then why does the closing prayer ignore what he said? In other words, we're not really serious about a communion or conversation with God when that's the case. And that sounds mean, but that needs to be addressed. We are building no romance with God in our churches. We're simply going through religious routines. And I'm not trying to be unkind. It's a crime. For they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knows what things ye have need of before you ask him. And then comes what we call the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer, and the interpretation and amplification of it extends down through verse 15. So we'll take up at verse 16, and here's the third religious exercise, or the third Christian exercise. Moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Isn't this interesting? They change their appearance to appear a certain way. That's what that says. They negate their appearance so their appearance will impress people. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou fastest, boy, I'm tempted when I read a passage like this to interpret as we go along, but if we do, we'll take away something from the study, so let's stay with it, the reading for the moment. But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face, that thou appear not unto men to fast, but unto thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Jot down 2 scripture references as we begin, and study these on your own. There'll be little tiny pithy statements. 1 Kings 17:2. Elijah has just told Ahab it's not going to be any rain around here for a long time. And then God said, here's the verse, go hide thyself by the brook Cherith. But in chapter 18, verse 1, there's the second one. After that long length of time, he then said, go show thyself. Now, here's a good devotional idea. Develop this for yourself and teach this. There are 2 kinds of ministries suggested there. One's the private, the other's the public. But notice the order. The private comes first. God pity the man who tries to minister in public, who does not have a strong private relationship with God. And the order is never to vary in spiritual things. Go hide yourself, and then once that job is done, in lonely ministry from God and to God, then you can go show yourself, and there will be authorization from heaven on your ministry. Now, the first word of this text here that we quoted from Jesus is a very, very strong word, and a very searching, sifting word. And it strongly suggests, by the very nature of the word, the tense of the verb is present tense, it suggests that we're constantly liable to the temptation and the sin that's pictured in this warning. What kind of sin is it? Well, it's a subtle sin. That's what makes it so dangerous. It would fall into the category of what has often been called respectable sins. And thus, it's represented on every church pew in every church in the world next Sunday. We will be there practicing this sin in all likelihood, and probably in massive numbers. And it's extremely dangerous because it's so respectable. Jot down this little phrase from Jesus. You'll recall it, but get hold of it. He once said, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." That's a powerful sentence. Now, what does that mean? What is leaven? Tell me how leaven works.
Puffs up.
What?
Puffs up.
Yeah, but what is it?
It infiltrates the whole
All right.
batch.
Is it a commanding appearance?
No.
No.
Hidden.
Very small,
Every little leaven leaven the whole
but
world.
very small, insignificant to appearance. What does it do? How do you use it?
You put it
In
in the
bread to make it rise.
All right,
bread
you
and-
penetrate pervasively the entire lump. So Jesus is warning us about something that's very small, unnoticeable, very inconspicuous in beginning, something that grows so slowly that it's hardly noticeable even in its growth, but something that soon penetrates everything it's in, even the most sacred and spiritual practices in your life when you follow through with what he was talking about. And he talked about the leaven of the Pharisees. And that's essentially what he's talking about in this passage. The subtle temptation and sin, and we'll identify it. I mean, it's easy to identify. Now, write down another introductory thing. Christians face two special temptations in this area. And they're almost precise opposites. Christians face two special temptations. Number one is to be a secret disciple in order to avoid persecution. See, that was the case with Nicodemus until he was flushed out into the open late in the Gospel of John. Said he was a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. So there's a temptation to be a secret disciple, and the more the pressure occurs in the culture where you are, the more the temptation is to go underground. Temptation to be a secret disciple in order to avoid persecution. The other is almost the opposite. It's the temptation to be a show-off disciple in order to receive the praise of men. And it should really alert us, if there weren't any statement in the passage, that Jesus gave such a long segment in the heart of the Sermon on the Mount devoted to this second temptation. What is the sin? It's the sin of, well, you can label it any one of a number of ways. It's the sin of attention getting. It's a sin of parade. It's a sin of display.
Blowing your own horn.
Blowing your own horn. Very good. Sin of
Right.
trying to impress others.
Pride in one.
Well,
Yes.
you still should live a life that when they see you, they see Christ.
We'll come to that.
Oh, okay.
I think you're right.
I mean,
See,
I mean, the thin line.
Absolutely. That's a good statement right there. Every truth is like a knife with a thin cutting edge, and on either side there's a deep ditch. Every truth. The one on negative, one side positive on the other. But truth is a very thin cutting thing. It wouldn't have any incision to it if it weren't thin and cutting. There'd be no incisiveness to it. But it is thin and cutting. Now, let me show you the secret of this entire passage. By the way, I stole the deal last week. I carried it home with me in my pocket. Didn't know it's my old Belgian marker. This is a dry erase. Now, watch this. I'm going to bring it into English. This is the word that is translated to be seen of them. And later in verse 5, that they may be seen of men. This is the word. Now, look at it carefully. Knock off the ending. Here's the ending. All right. There's where we get our English word, theater. Now, do you begin to get the idea? This is the reason I call this study theatrical righteousness.
Oh, I saw a preacher like that on TV.
No, you see him in church. You don't see him on TV. You don't see him on TV anymore than you see him in church. But we hide better in church. Preachers have to be aware of impressing people. It's the most dangerous vocation in the world. Because we slip into this, and, well, it's almost like being proud of your humility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, how do you win? In other words, without the grace of God, none of this stands a chance. And so we ought to be praying. I mean, your spiritual leader is in the most dangerous position of anybody in this city. And he lives there all the time. And we just take that for granted and abandon him to all these temptations and sins and assume, well, he's looking okay, he's not doing bad. But I promise you, hell is cutting loose on him with the biggest barrage imaginable all the time. I had a lady tell me in my study one day, she said, well, I wish I could be like you preachers. Said, you just sit here and read the Bible all day long. I said, that gives me 12 pains I can't locate. If you knew what pressures there are in this, and I'm not trying to court pity when I say that, it's just true. Pressures that nobody else will ever know anything about. The devil tries to tear you to pieces, dismantle you, and decimate you in every conceivable way. He will attack you in every way. And that simply is flattering to who you are and where you are. I mean, if you're not causing him to lose his sleep, he won't give you time of day. It's when you're causing him to lose sleep that you have problems with him. But this is the word right here. So Jesus is talking about theatrical righteousness. It's what I call Mr. Peacock Incorporated. It's the sin of pluming your feathers and letting everybody see. Sin of putting piety on parade. Now, it's interesting. The thing that really stimulated this study was two articles that were in the recent papers the last few days. One was about 10 days ago, and one was even more recent. And I'll read the one that's more recent because it is absolutely classic. In the appeal section, this is the first one of about 10 days ago, of the commercial appeal, there was an article about the actress who played Virginia Woolf in the movie. Is anyone familiar with the Virginia Woolf story? Well, this is a pretty raw story. Don't see the movie, don't read the book. It's not worth your time. It's the one that one of those that projected Elizabeth Taylor years ago into the horror fame that she became known for, the immoral fame she became known for. But I don't know who the actress was. I don't remember. I think it was Nicole Kidman. And she plays Virginia Woolf, and they showed her picture. I don't know that I've ever seen her in action. But they showed her picture. She's a beautiful, beautiful young woman. And then they showed the makeup job that they did to turn her into Virginia Woolf. And there's no way you would recognize the two people as the same persons. They said it took 2 hours a day to make the makeup job, plus it was a thrust against her ego because it made this beautiful young woman look like this ugly, almost witch.
Maybe that's when they called her Wolf.
You put them side by side. Well, but now be careful that you get this. Here's what the article said, quote, if anyone ever became the person she plays, she did. Now see, this is my biggest problem with Hollywood. You cannot put that mask on that many times without becoming the character whose mask you're wearing. So look at Clint Eastwood. See, on film, he forced himself to become in real life what he looked like on film by the roles he was playing, and probably was somewhere between flipping back and forth in both of those. We don't want to blame the roles too much because he may have carried his character to the role the other way around. But there's big problems there. But I want to read to you an account. Are you familiar with the story of Catch Me If You Can? You want to know that one?
It's a new movie, right?
Yeah, do you know the story? It's a true story. It's literally a true story. Let me read the article. And you'll think I'm wasting time, but I'm not. This is precisely what this passage is about. Let me show you. The word translated hypocrite. That's a theatrical. Is that
That's right.
That's a $5 word for a con man.
well, but what does it mean?
That's an E on it.
There's an E on the end of it. Yeah, okay. What does it mean? Do you see, we just take these words for granted. Do not take these words for granted. Do not ever take a word for granted. Find out what it means.
Hypo means under.
All right, this means under. And this is the word for a mask.
Yeah.
Actually, this is the word for judging someone under a mask. It's actually the word for final judgment, coupled with the word here. And so, yeah, that's where we get our word critic. And so it means an under judgment is what it means. In other words, here's a person wearing a mask and you're judging from the front, so you're judging him in light of the mask that he's wearing. Are you seeing the real person? No. You're seeing the mask. And the idea is that Greek and Roman drama, a person could play as many as 5 or 6 roles in one drama by carrying a stick with a mask on it. He would step backstage and put the mask that would cover him, and he had a voice enhancing device where he could change the device and change his voice, and so he would come out as the same person but wearing a different mask and probably wearing a different role, and this is precisely the word that is used here. In other words, it's back to that same thing. It's parading something that you really are not. Now, let me show you the illustration. This was just yesterday in the Commercial Appeal. It's entitled DiCaprio is Familiar with Imposter Role. Playing a con artist in Catch Me If You Can wasn't much of a stretch for Leonardo DiCaprio. Quote, acting, and that's what this word means. It's stage actor. Acting is all about being an imposter. The 28-year-old told reporters Sunday in Berlin. The movie opens in Germany on Thursday. The movie chronicles the early years of real-life grifter Frank Abagnale, who pursued conventional success and respectability through the unconventional methods of counterfeiting checks and falsifying identities. Surely you've had some exposure to this story. It's one incredible story. By the time he was arrested by FBI agent Carl Hanratty, played by Tom Hanks in the movie, Abagnale had written $2.5 million in bad checks and had successfully passed himself off as an airline pilot, a teacher, a doctor, and a lawyer. He's a professional actor, said DiCaprio, who met Abagnale to prepare for the role. Quote, I was immediately disarmed by his charm. After they captured him, he kept ducking from one identity to another so they couldn't catch up with him. And he did it convincingly, convinced everybody in his wake about all these identities that he assumed. And when they caught him, they prosecuted him, put him in jail. You know what he's doing now? He's working for the FBI on bad check recovery. Listen to that line. Acting is all about being an imposter. That's what this passage is about. The word hypocrite. I dug out of my library an old book that I read probably 30, 40 years ago. This is a book by a South African Dutchman named Joost de Blanc. And it's in a series called Preaching for Today. It's an old, rather archaic series. And these are not good sermons, but the titles are incredible. It's like the window dressing is good, but what's in the warehouse is not so good. Listen to the titles. The Pharisee in Us. You know that with a different silhouette than the one I see when I look at you, there's a Pharisee inside of you. There's a Pharisee inside of me, lurking. He's like a jack in the box. Press the button, up he comes. Here's the second one. The publican in us. That's the opposite. Pharisee parades righteousness. The publican can't hide sin. Here's the third one. The Herodian and the zealot. Those are opposites. See, the Herodian sold out to Rome, was a protector of Rome. The zealot was a patriot, an arch-patriot of the Jews standing against Rome. The Herodian and the zealot in us. And then the Sadducee in us. Who were the Sadducees?
They were liberals.
Liberals, and what didn't they believe?
The resurrection.
Resurrection. Didn't believe in supernatural life. Didn't believe in angels, afterlife, resurrection. Didn't believe in anything that had the touch of the supernatural on it. So what he's saying, he's got some good ideas in these sermons. They're just not good sermons, but they're occasionally good ideas, is that lurking in every one of us is the demon that we always score when we read about this in the Bible, and yet each one of us has this person in us. In other words, if there's no daily salvation, we don't have a chance anymore today. If I've been saved 40 years, I don't have any more chance today unless there's a today's salvation, an ongoing process in me than I had of being saved the day before I was saved. So sanctification is as crucial as this original salvation. And this passage scores some of these things. Now, let's outline it. Let me erase here for just a moment. I'll put the three main themes in different headings. And you can use any one of several headings here. The first one is about philanthropy. This is in verses 1 through 4. Now, well, let me go ahead and explain this word in case here's another word that we take for granted. I watched on the History Channel the other night the life story of Teddy Roosevelt. It's classic. I mean, fantastic. I'm thinking about ordering that video from the History Channel. But in it, Teddy Roosevelt said, "My father was without question the greatest man I ever knew in my life." And he apparently was devastated. His wife, whom he dearly loved, and his father died within 11 hours of each other. And he was just absolutely devastated. So here was a man who was hampered by several things, physically and psychologically, and a lot of adverse circumstances. But history says this man's only interest in life was to be a philanthropist. In other words, to take care of poor people. That's a pretty remarkable testimony in itself. But look at this word right here. This comes from the word phileo or philos. That's brotherly love or social compassion. That's what that word means. This is the Greek word for man, anthropos. Now get this, to show you why we ought to be careful when we run into words like this. That's what this first one is about. Almsgiving is philanthropy. Or it's the old archaic Christian word, charity. We use that, the Bible uses it for love, but it's actually the giving to needy people. But now look at the richness of this language. This word right here is also a compound word. This part, ana or anna, means up or upward. It's a word Jesus used. He said, you must be born anothen. You must be born from above so that you're born upward. This word means this is the upreaching person. So this is the person who stands up, who reaches up, who looks up. In other words, this is in the Greek language the acknowledgement that man is made for God. In the Dennis the Menace cartoons, occasionally those guys get loose and do an adult thing in a children's cartoon. And in this one, Mrs. Mitchell is reading to Dennis, and she reads this line: "Man is the only animal who prays." And then in the last frame, she says with a wistful look, "or needs to." See, that's this word right here. The other animals don't look up. Other animals do not have an upward frame of reference. Man reaches up, looks up, stands up. That's the word that's used here. So this word is the word for man. So a philanthropist is a person, a man who practices giving because of social compassion. That's what this word means. Now that's the idea here. The almsgiving is not to be scored. It's how it's done that's the problem. The almsgiving is commendable. That's the reason it becomes a problem, because we look for the commendation instead of giving because of the need. So Jesus said, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, these things. In other words, don't be parading anything. This is an expression of stewardship. It's an expression of stewardship, or the way you manage your money. And please note, in all three cases here of the three practices, Jesus did not say if you do them. He said when you do them. So he assumed for us that these are valid practices that we should consider and do. This one has to do with donations to other people. So this is the matter of philanthropy. It's in the category of stewardship, and the act is donations to other people. Now, the second one, and we'll come back to this one in just a moment. The second one is about prayer. And there are various words in the New Testament for prayer, and every one of them is a giant universe in itself. This has to do with devotions to God. See, this has to do with donations to those in need. This has to do with devotions in relation to God, or devotions with God. The third one, and I'm going to use an advisory word here, is the area of penance or self-correction. This has to do with discipline of self. And the reason I use the word penance is this is the Catholic idea that you save yourself by correcting yourself or by doing deeds of penance, things of penance. But this is a good word. It means there are times when self-operations have to occur, corrections have to take place. And this is the practice of the discipline of self. So, all three areas. Now, let's take them one at a time. Remember, we're talking about theatrical righteousness. Okay, the first one. Let me erase everything else that's up here, except that one. You'll notice that in every case here, all three cases, Jesus gives us two things under every heading. Two things. First, he tells us the wrong way to do this. That's what he's warning us against. And then he tells us the wise way to do this. And we tend, when we hear the warning, to get so alert that we dismiss doing it at all. And that's easy to do because, after all, philanthropy, that wouldn't be your favorite leisure time activity. And so you tend not to do it at all. But he says there's a wrong way to do it. He says in verse 2, when you give your alms, and he uses three terms that show the wrong way. The word trumpets, in other words, don't sound it out. The word synagogues, you seek some prominent place at church to do it, or on the streets, you do it in public. James Barrie, if you're a fan of literature, you'll recognize that name. He described a man like this, quote, he was a pious man who had only one apparent fault. He religiously fulfilled his duties, but somehow he always managed to rattle the cans. Everybody here? He always managed to rattle the cans. Now, at this point, tend not to notice these together. Put these texts side by side. This is at the end of Acts chapter 4. And because of the chapter division, we don't notice the contrast, but it's right across the chapter division. It comes the story of Ananias and Sapphira. This is Barnabas, who set in motion his entire useful history, one of the most useful saints in the early church, by a gift that he gave, negotiating land into cash and then giving the cash to the needy situation because of suffering Christians. He gave the money to them, and then right across the page is Ananias and Sapphira, who pretended to give more than they gave because they wanted the accolades that they saw he was apparently getting, and so they gave some money and said they were giving it all when they kept back part, and he ended up in the history of God's book always advancing. They ended up wherever. And here's the contrast right there, glaring on the page. And actually the matter of almsgiving, so be very careful about how you give. And then there's a wise way to do it. Jot down another reference under the wise way to do it. Matthew 25, verses 31 and following. Let's turn to that. Matthew 25. We only look at just one part of it. Matthew 25, 35 and 35 to 40. And it's a shame this has been interpreted so many wild ways, because if you let this stand at face value, it's an incredible passage. If you don't try to interpret it some way to mean something that it doesn't say, and that's usually what happens, frankly, with this passage. This is interpreted dispensationally, and thus it's erased. In other words, the brethren are only Jews in the dispensational interpretation. I think that's unfair to the text. Look at verse 35. For I was hungry, you gave me meat. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. Stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, you came unto me. Now here's the secret of these people. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, what are you talking about? We never saw you hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked. We never saw you sick and in prison. See, they were unself-conscious in ministering to people's needs. They weren't looking for accolades and didn't know really fully what they were doing. They were just trying to meet needs. And the king shall answer and say unto them, I think this is the secret of all of this. Everything we do, we should do it as unto Jesus. When you preach, he's your only audience. When you pray, he's your only audience. Inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. S.D. Gordon, one of the great devotional writers of the modern history of the church, said his entire ministry was changed when he had a dream one night. And he was preaching, so it was a realistic dream, and he was facing his audience so he could see his audience. And behold, on the front row sat Jesus. He said for the first time in his life, he realized what it would be like to literally preach with Jesus in the audience. And he said from that point on, he made up his mind he was never going to preach again without seeing Jesus in the audience. And it changed his entire ministry. So the matter of philanthropy, the wise way is to do it as unto him. The wrong way is to do it parading. Now let's take the second one. The second one is prayer. And this is verses 5 through 8. And again, there's exactly the same outline. And Jesus says exactly the same thing. He says the wrong way to do it. Now, let me give you another clue. There's not any way you can exhaust this passage, so we need to be adding some things as we go along. Every time, for example, in verse 2, he said, when thou doest thine alms, the pronoun is emphatic. Now, I hope you can catch on quickly as to why that's important. When you do this, don't do it like others do. That's verse 3, I beg your pardon. And then in verse 5, he says, in verse 6, he says, but you, when you pray, that's emphatic. In other words, you're not to be like other people. There's something awfully big there. He's got high goals for his people. So, prayer the wrong way. The wrong way is the Pharisees' way, where prayer was a regulated public ritual that could easily call attention to itself. Now, under this, put down two kinds of prayer, and I'll popularize the statement. One I call horizontal prayer, and the other I call vertical prayer. And these are very real categories, though they won't sound so at first. This one came home to me years ago. I was reading the account of the life of Phillips Brooks, a great Boston pastor, and he was one incredible man. He walked down the street in Boston. In fact, they put up a statue in Boston Common with him kneeling and Jesus standing up tall over him with his hand on his shoulder, and Roman Catholics created such a fuss about it that they had to take it down. But then the public in the city of Boston created such a fuss about that they had to put it back up. And he was walking down the street one day, and there was a guy in a shop, and had asked the shopkeeper, what is a Christian? And he saw Phillips Brooks walk by the window at that moment. He said, that's the definition of a Christian. He was that kind of man. Here's what Phillips Brooks said, and if you know his history, this will sound like one thing, but it won't sound like Phillips Brooks. He said he went to a giant gathering where a high church official was asked to lead the opening prayer. And here's what he said publicly later. And this is not like Phillips Brooks at all, but it scores a point. That's the reason it scores so heavily. He said, it was the most beautiful prayer ever prayed to a Boston audience. Hello? To a Boston audience. This is horizontal prayer. See, where you know you're on parade, and this is extremely difficult to do, to be genuine with God while you're leading public prayer in front of a large group of people, or in front of anybody else. It's very difficult to do. It'd be far wiser to be quiet for a little while and get your heart in tune and ask God to make you genuine so you're just with Him. It's very difficult to do. So we really need each other's help here. We need to be aware that this is a real temptation for ourselves, a real temptation for anybody else. In other words, God will categorically pass us by unless we keep this corrected. And we won't have to ask, are we doing it right or wrong, just see whether God's present or not. If He endorses it, then He's pleased and He's enjoying Himself there. If He doesn't, that doesn't mean we run tediously or self-consciously. This is a happy vocation. But the wrong way, again, is the Pharisees' way. This is in verses 5, 7, and 8, the wrong way. And the passage here is Luke 18, 9 through 14, the contrast between the Pharisee and the publican in the temple. And here's an interesting thing. When it says the Pharisee stood and prayed, now listen to this, with himself. Do you ever read anything like this? He stood and prayed, and this is the word pros, face to face with himself. And his first word was God. Now watch carefully. In a Greek text, there is no punctuation. The translator has to determine where the punctuation is. So tell me what you read right there. He prayed with himself, God. Now, don't look pious, because this is everybody. This is what sin is. Himself, God. That's the definition of sin. That's what you were saved from. And you have the residual effect of it in you right now. So you can you can insert yourself back into God's position at any time and assume his role. And it's called carnality in a Christian. It's called being natural in a lost man. It means you're self-centered. In other words, you're satanic. Carnality means there's a satanic Christian at the moment. Hello. This word is this big, means to strike a pose. So this guy did a Napoleon portrait. He struck a pose in the temple that day. And he prayed with himself. Whether there's a comma here or not makes no difference. He was praying to himself. He addressed God, apparently, but he still only talked to himself. And this is the contrast. The publican wouldn't even lift his eyes. And he beat on his chest. Why? Because he had found the source of his problem. See, our problem is we're saved enough and far enough removed from our lostness that we don't remember that lostness, but we've still got that residual effect in us, and we act like it's not even there. We just go on like everything's okay because we're not having any drunken problems today, haven't raped anybody yesterday on a parking lot, so everything looks okay. You've got the residual effect of that man down inside of you right now, popping out at any moment. See, this calls for what the book calls humility. It means we get down where we belong. And whatever we do in public, we live before God where we belong. The wrong way is to parade it. The wise way is to have a private place. This is in verse 6. To have a private place and a private practice that is powerful enough that it overwhelms whatever you do in public. Let me say it again. You have a private place and a private relationship with God that is so effective and powerful. It means if you have to linger to get that settled, linger. It's worth it. In order that whatever you do in public is overwhelmed and empowered and conditioned by what you do in private. So go hide yourself comes before go show yourself. There's the second one. Now the third one. The third one is in the matter of disciplines of self, or what I call penance, or self-correction. Discipline of self. This is the fasting passage. This is in verses 16 through 18. Now note again, Jesus does not command it. He does not abolish it. He simply assumes it. And
Is it expectation?
that we will. He doesn't indicate that here, but I think that is safe to say elsewhere. Here, it's an assumption when you do it. And perhaps you could include expectation in that statement. I would ask how many of you have ever fasted, but that wouldn't be fair. But if you have, then you know the benefits of it. In the times I have fasted, and it's precious too few times, but here's what I find. The first day is an agony. The second day is an absolute reversal. It's a total victory. The second day I've lost all taste. I've always asked God to begin to take away my taste for food, and it got actually dangerous. He answered the prayer so much. I have a very close disciple brother who has fasted for 30 days. And that's nothing but some kind of, you understand what I mean when I say juice liquids or solid liquids, and no solid food at all. He turned almost jaundiced in color and lost, I don't know how much, but boy, you talk about time. He said, and I can substantiate this myself. God has never been more real to me in my life than on the second, third, and fourth days of the fast. Because your mind is totally alert, and when you turn to Him at all, the focus is absolutely incredible, which I cannot do when my digestive system is absorbed with distraction. It just can't be done. I mean, there's an integrity here that we have not explored. The goal of all these things is to keep these practices God-centered and without stress. It's a happy thing. Now, let me identify the three of them, mention the wrong and right way, and then we'll go and read the final few pages. Write this down. Almsgiving is an adjustment to human need. Almsgiving is an adjustment to human need. Almsgiving is an adjustment to human need. Prayer is an attachment to God. Prayer is an attachment to God. Fasting is a detachment from self and the world. So you can easily see the balance of these in relationship with God. One's social, one's essentially what you would call spiritual. They're all spiritual, but it's definitively spiritual. And the other is with regard to self. Now, the wrong way of fasting, Jesus uses a strange term. He says they put on appearances to make appearances. And he doesn't, like I said, he doesn't abolish it or commend it. He simply assumes it. And the wise way is to do it without any parade, to be as inconspicuous as possible. Verses 17 and 18. Write down one more thing, and then I'll pass out the manuscripts and we'll read the last part, because there are a couple of illustrations I want you to get. Here's the quote I want you to write down. Am I playing to God or playing to the gallery? Playing to the gallery is a theater term. It means you're more conscious of your audience than anything else. And of course, theatrically, you need to be. That's what this is talking about. Playing the game to God means that all of it is subject to His inspection and seeking His approval. Playing to the gallery means you're looking for the applause of men. And Paul said, if I get the applause of men, I cannot please God. If I go for that. Pass those around.
Yes, sir.
And turn to page 5, I believe it is. And it won't take us 5 minutes maybe, so let's start it right at the top of page 5.
Does not a preacher, in a sense, act?
Absolutely. In
I
fact,
mean, when I am before a group, I act what I feel from God.
and there's no way you could,
I just,
well, in
I
fact,
don't know how.
in a sense, he has to get out of character. Because, and here's the glory of preaching, that the good side of that is he preaches above his character and thus rises to his preaching. And that's the reason most people in the church will never be as good a Christian as the pastor is. Why? Because they never say it, and thus they never are forced to rise. You will always pursue your confession. The ministry has this advantage. It forces the man to say things beyond himself, and thus he rises beyond himself. In other words, he will pursue those things by saying them, while the other people only hearing them will never do. So the devil will do anything to keep a person in church from repeating the truth he just heard. And I haven't talked about the preacher, I haven't talked about the crowd, I haven't talked about the offerings, about the atmosphere, about the look of the church. He'll have them talking about anything but the truth they just heard. And so typically the preacher's the best Christian in the church because he's the one who says it all the time. And it requires a measure of being out of character, a measure of acting. Isn't that an incredible thing? Well, we'll see that. You mentioned it a while ago when you broke in at the beginning. We'll see that as we conclude. Let me just read from the top of page 5 and just follow. The renowned philosopher and author Carl Sandburg, you remember he's the one who wrote the biography, the lengthy biography of Lincoln. It's a classic. He rightly spoke of man's vanity when he said, quote, "Every man wants to play Hamlet. He wants to have the starring role and get the Oscar. Every man wants the limelight. But human glorification never produces God's glory." One author said, "Where people are made too much up front, God leaves by the back." The stark realism should be of, if that's in or is your text. Stark realism of Jesus is evident throughout this passage. In all three cases, when man courts the applause of men instead of the approval of God, Jesus said, "Verily I say unto you, they have their reward." He did not say, as we might have expected, rewards don't matter. Realistically, he knows full well that rewards do matter, but he distinguishes between social rewards doled out by the world and spiritual rewards given by God. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus pictures the Christian life in terms of a relationship between a father and his children. Because this is its nature, the commercial factor falls away from Jesus' doctrine of rewards. After all, what father pays for a child's performance? A true father's reward to his child is, first of all, himself. However the reward is expressed, it is his own closeness and approval. So it's important, very important, that believers know that their Heavenly Father notices and approves what they do, and that he approves as a living, loving, caring Father. We cannot live without responses from those who mean most to us. And it would be very foolish to imagine that God calls his people to almost superhuman sacrifices and then fails to react, respond, reward. Years ago I heard this statement: "A passion can only be overcome by a greater passion." Here's an example. The human drive to be impressive to people is so deep-seated that Jesus knows it can only be countered and conquered by the still deeper drive to be impressive to the Father. The desire for human applause must be replaced by the desire for heaven's approval. When Jesus said of the self-parading religionists, "They have their reward," he used the commercial term that was used in his day for business transactions. It was actually stamped on the receipt, paid in full. The reward of the self-centered, self-parading religionist is that he gets what he sought, what he wanted, what he courted, the immediate approval of men. I could say, but nothing beyond that. However, when he gets that reward, he'll get no reward from the Father in heaven. In his case, all the rewards that are allowable have already been given by the time he gets to the Father. What's the bottom line of this passage? Bottom line is this: while it's possible to use your religion as a subtle cover-up for selfishness, self-parade, self-advancement, and sin, God, on the other hand, wants to form special people out of those who worship him. In each case, when Jesus addressed his people, he set them in distinction from others, saying, "But you." And in each case, the word "you" bears major emphasis. His people should be fully responsible in all their faith practices, thoroughly other-centered, and that's other with a capital O, that's God, and other-centered, that's other people, in their daily lives, and not dominated by their self-lives as most of the world is. What a bondage it is to always have to play to the gallery, always trying to impress. Let's turn that over. Play to the gallery. What a bondage it is to always have to play to the gallery, always trying to impress other people, always bound to self-attentiveness. The invisible God has a certain pleasure in invisible deeds. But our flesh naturally courts high visibility and plenty of recognition. Through responsible almsgiving, through relational prayer, and through spiritual self-denial, God seeks to bring each of us into right relationships with our society, with our sovereign, and with ourselves. Let me close with a balancing word. It's a thin pancake that doesn't have two sides, and this truth has another side to it. Jesus said, "Let your light," this is in chapter 5, verse 14, "let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So God first said to Elijah, "Go hide yourself," before he said, "Go show yourself." There's a private ministry for a Christian and a public ministry. The private ministry should be so powerful that the Christian doesn't yield to the glare of the spotlights in the public ministry. Well, here is a great illustration. in the one case you see the wrong side, in the other case you see the wise side. And boy, they are both glaringly on those sides. This morning's Memphis newspaper, that's when I was writing this, the commercial appeal, and this is the day before the Super Bowl. So this is, I think that's right, it's on Saturday. This morning's Memphis newspaper, the commercial appeal, carried articles on the sports page which were placed side by side. I've got the articles right here with me. One was entitled, "Sapp Doesn't Shy from Spotlight," an article about all-star defensive tackle Warren Sapp, who plays for the Super Bowl bound, I'd say Super Bowl winner, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In the pregame Super Bowl hype, Sapp is courting attention on, quote, "the biggest stage in the world." Actually, I'm being kind to him in what's said here. The article really profiled him as a self-aggrandizing person, calling him, quote, "the round mound of sound." The article tells of Sapp's use of the football platform to broadcast himself into prominence, and he makes no bones about it. He says that's what he wants, what he's always wanted. He said he's on his stage. On the same page, an adjacent article told of David Robinson. Now, if you know him, you know the difference in character. This is one godly, and yet with heavy spotlight on him all the time. You read his accolades, and they read like the absolute superstar of NBA basketball, the awards he's received. On the same page, an adjacent article told of David Robinson, the superstar basketball player for the San Antonio Spurs, quote, "chosen in 1996 as one of the NBA's 50 greatest players ever." This article told of the league-wide, community-wide, and beyond respect which Robinson commands. One opposing coach said of Robinson, "He's won everything you can win, but the thing about David is how he's a true gentleman, how he's handled himself with class. He's the epitome of what you'd like every NBA player to be." In a section where reporters, that is a sports section, where reporters are reluctant to report genuine faith, the article said, quote, "The spiritual Robinson is very much a man of the cloth, even though his pulpit has usually been the paint." Robinson himself is quoted, "We started the David Robinson Foundation because we wanted to emulate what Jesus did in his community. Our scripture is that if you're at the top of the world, you can't hide under a lampshade. Because you're at the top, you must touch everybody because God gave me more than I ever hoped for." Now, I wish you knew him as well as I know him. That's an understatement. This kind of balance requires the special grace. Now, to me, to do a study like this highlights those two words. If we're not covered by grace, we don't have a chance in things like this, because these are subtle temptations and subtle and respectable sins. This kind of balance requires the special grace that God gives to those who walk with him. David Robinson, by the testimony of teammate and opponent, community and sports world at large, walks with God and maintains the balance. Now back to the main message. Let me conclude with a story which shows the role we all may play, courting no attention, but gratified that God is using us to glorify himself and rescue people for him. Charles Plumb was a United States Navy jet pilot in Vietnam. After 75 combat missions, his plane was destroyed by a surface-to-air missile. Plumb ejected and parachuted into enemy hands. He was captured and spent 6 years in a communist Vietnamese prison. He survived the ordeal and now lectures on lessons learned from that experience. One day when Plumb and his wife were sitting in a restaurant, a man at another table came up and said, "You're Plumb. You flew jet fighters in Vietnam from the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. You were shot down." "How in the world did you know that?" asked Plumb. "I packed your parachute," the man replied. Plumb gasped in surprise and gratitude. The man pumped his hand and said, "I guess it worked." Plumb assured him it sure did. If your chute hadn't worked, I wouldn't be here today." Plumb couldn't sleep that night, thinking about that man. Plumb says, "I kept wondering what he had looked like in a Navy uniform." white hat, bib in the back, bell-bottom trousers. I wonder how many times I might have seen him and not even said good morning, how are you, or anything. Because you see, I was a fighter pilot and he was just a sailor. Plum thought of the many hours the sailor had spent at a long wooden table in the bowels of the ship, carefully weaving the shrouds and folding the silks of each chute, holding in his hand each time the fate of someone he didn't know and might never see. Who packed your parachute? Out of sight and unsung. Whose parachute are you packing? Out of sight and unsung. Remember that God sees and rewards those who don't court human applause as much as they simply seek His approval. You know when that illustration came? I was sitting at the computer, wrote the last lines preceding that illustration, and touched the send and receive key, and this came from one of my disciples in the Carolinas. And
I've seen it on email.
I've seen it, but I've seen the illustration before, but it never would have occurred to me to put it in here, and it is the perfect. It's exactly the way the Holy Spirit works. It's a perfect conclusion, and I never would have, though I've seen it before, knew the story, never would have thought of using it. But when I saw it, I actually got up and started to walk away, and suddenly it hit me. What did I just read? It's the perfect illustration to close this study. Anybody got an observation?
I too like to clip things out of the paper.
It's a great source of illustration.
It is. There's a Presbyterian conference here in town. Comment says, I would like for the people who come to consider what it means for Christians to claim that Jesus is the King of the whole world.
All right, that was the Patrick message on
How
Friday
can we
night.
possibly believe such a thing?
But who said that? Who said the last thing? Did Patrick say that in his message? That was on Friday night.
That was, yeah, Pratt.
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 Pratt said Patrick.
Pratt.
Yeah, that was his whole message, and he challenged it from. It was a conference on comparative faiths, on Jesus among Jesus among the gods, and his message was the keynote message of the whole thing. But Robbie Zacharias was the bell ringer boy.
I thought it was. I don't know, but the other guy. He rung my bell.
The other guy did.
Yeah, when you said that.
Yeah, but Zacharias, I believe he's the greatest apologist on earth today.
Is that right?
Yeah,
I'm surprised he was.
I mean, incredible. Get an album of his studies, of his apologetic studies. Let's stand. Grab hands. I'd like to make a circle when we come close.